All right, in Unit 4, we are going to be looking at the nervous system. So coming out of the skeletal system, we know that bones at joints can move. So now we have to kind of step back and look at how do we send those messages like to muscles so that muscles can contract to allow for that movement. So let's get going. So when we look at the overall function of the nervous system, there's three listed there, but when they say they're overlapping, that means there's not like one leads to the next, which leads to the next. It's not like there's this function, which is completely separate from this function. Your nervous system's job is to gather information or have information come up to your brain, have it be processed, make decisions, and then send messages back out. So it's a constant flow. So when we talk about your sensory function, what kind of information are we gathering? We're gathering, is something touching you? Is it hot? Is it cold? Do you see something coming towards you? Do you hear something that could be dangerous? Do you taste something that isn't right? So you should, don't eat that and spit it back out. So any of that sensory information, which we will tackle in our last, like the exact senses, like how you hear, how you see, for example, we're going to deal with that at the very end of the unit. For right now, just you have these senses, that information going in, so coming like from your hands or from your arm up to your brain is going to be the sensory function. The integration function is that processing. What do we need to do about it? So if, for example, let me grab something over here, like if I was talking with a pencil in my hand and as I was talking it flew out of my hand and you see a pencil coming this way, so here it is flying towards you, right? So as it flies towards you, your eyes see this spinning pencil. Your brain will integrate and say, I need to move out of the way, so I'm going to make the decision to send a message out, that is the motor output function, down your arms, down to your legs so that you can like dodge to the side, right? So the motor output part would be your muscle cells that are contracting, causing the movement itself, so the pull on those bones. So when we look at your overall nervous system, there are two main parts. There's your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is where all of that integration and processing occurs. So if we go back and we look at these three functions, the integration function is handled by the central nervous system. So notice that's our brain. That's what you normally really think of when you think about integration and processing. Where's your memory? Where's your decisions being made? But your spinal cord is also part of the central nervous system, and there is a low level of processing that occurs there. So as part of this unit towards the end, we will talk about reflexes, for example. So the fact that if someone like shines a light in your eye, like a really bright light, and it changes the size of your pupil, so your eye, you can see the black spot, like it'd be like, oh, that's too bright, and it shuts down. That is an integration part that your spinal cord will have handled. Or you go to the doctor, it's technically a little tiny piece of your brainstem, but let me give you an example of a spinal cord one. So you go to the doctor and they use that little hammer and they like tap you on the knee and you make sure your knee kick out or your bottom of your leg kick out. That processing occurred in your spinal cord. Your spinal cord said, hey, we're not supposed to be in that position. We better fix it. Sends a message down to your quadricep muscle to contract, so you kick your leg out. So there is a purpose for that, and we'll come back to that. So, but your spinal cord has low-level types of processing. It's obviously not making decisions for you like, hey, I need to move across the room. That's your brain, but your spinal cord does do some processing. Your peripheral nervous system is doing those functions 1 and 3. It's doing the sensory information coming in, so like from your hands, from your feet, like up your legs and arms, into your spinal cord and then up to your brain, and it's taking the messages back out. So in other words, messages coming from your brain or from your spinal cord back to your arms and legs, that is your peripheral nervous system. And so those messages are going to be passed through what are called nerves. Now, nerves themselves are actually made up of lots of different kinds of cells and tissues, the most important being the one that's actually passing the message, which is the neuron. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about neurons, that one specific kind of cell. But you can see how the sensory input going in, that is going to be peripheral nervous system, gets into your spinal cord or brain, that is the integration part, which is central nervous system, and then the messages coming back out to muscles to cause movement, for example, that is going to be your peripheral nervous system as well. So let's just look at a nerve. So what makes up a nerve? You can see it's this big bundle of stuff. So yes, there's some blood vessels. These are living cells. There's a lot of connective tissue in there holding these different cells together. But the main cell that we're going to be looking at is called a neuron. So this one cell, notice there's lots of them. So lots of these neurons are going to make up what we think of as the nerve. So if you were to take apart like your vacuum cleaner and you were to cut the cord open and like look inside, there'd be lots of wires, together taking this the electricity like down the wire, like to the vacuum itself from the plug. And so imagine all of these different cells as just individual wires grouped together. So obviously we know we're going to be focused at this level as opposed to like the big level. Just know that they do travel. They travel in packs, so to speak. Just as a side note, if you ever you hit your elbow and just like that horrible, like seeing like, kind of pain, or you're like, oh, my funny bone, obviously not funny because you're in agony. What you've done is you've actually like smashed the nerve. There's a nerve, a really big one that comes up around your elbow here, and you just like smash the living daylights out of it. And it's sending a message to your brain that is unhappy town. So I am going to show you a picture of a real nerve with an open arm. So they have cut open and you're going to see. So if that's not your cup of tea, close your eyes. So this is running along the ulna, and you can see like it's big. So there's a ton of different individual cells called neurons that are carrying messages in a bundle that are, in this case, that's called the ulnar nerve. Okay, picture over. So when we look at what is making up nervous system tissue, like I said, the main guy, there's going to be two main types of cells. The main guy we're going to spend a ton of time talking about are neurons. Notice how I have functional unit of the nervous system. If it's red, so if you're colorblind, it's red. It's bold. If I could make it sing and dance and flash at you, I would do that as well. What I mean by functional unit, that means the nervous system's job is to pass messages. The neuron is doing that function. The neuron is passing that message. So who's the functional unit? Who's the one passing the messages in the nervous system? It's going to be the neuron, which means when we get into the second type of cell, he is not going to be the functional unit. He's not passing the message. So when we say passing a message, we mean something called an action potential. So an action potential is going to be the message that's being passed or conducted. That's what conduction means, to be passed down the cell itself. And so if you have, let's say, something cold touching you at your finger, and your brain is interpreting like, oh, something is cold touching my finger, that's cold. That means there's a neuron going, sensory cell here in your finger, in your dermis, and there's going to be a neuron going all the way up your arm, to your spinal cord, up to your brain, so that it can receive that cold message, which means that an action potential went down a neuron, passing to get up to your brain. So when we think about the brain itself for the integration, all the jobs of the brain, like you think of like anything that you can think of, like I have to remember stuff, I have to make decisions, I have to problem solve, I have to decide if I like something or don't like something. All of those things are controlled by neurons. So your brain is just a ton of neurons sending information all the way around. So you have information coming up, information being passed around, neuron to neuron to neuron. So when we look at the kinds of neurons, there are neurons that are in our central nervous system. Those are the ones in our brain and our spinal cord. And there are neurons in our peripheral nervous system. I do want you to know that there is a slight difference between the two in their ability to repair themselves. So when we look at central nervous system neurons, the one in your spinal cord and your brain, notice they cannot go through mitosis. They cannot divide. They cannot make new ones of themselves. Unlike when we talked about skin, if you were to lose some skin cells, then you make new skin cells, right? Your epidermis can make new epidermal cells through the stratum basal. Or if you have a deeper wound and it's in the connective tissue, you have fibroblast cells that will make new collagen and elastin to fill in that connective tissue. In your central nervous system, if you lose brain cells or spinal cord cells, if they become damaged, they cannot go through mitosis to make new ones of themselves. They are just done. Like you have lost that cell and whatever it is particularly controlling. In your peripheral nervous system, there is a teeny tiny bit of ability to repair depending on where the damage occurred. So just as I'm not going to ask you about this whole process, but in a peripheral nervous system, if you were to like cut yourself at this in this middle part, we're going to learn this is called the axon. So if you're like, I'm a sous chef, chop, 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 and then you were to cut through, and you were to cut through these guys here, your immune system would clean up the mess, like, oh, all this stuff down here is going to die. But then this piece here would start to regenerate slowly but surely, and make connection back to the muscle so that you have function again. So this takes time. It could take weeks, it could take months, but it is possible as long as this main part of the peripheral nervous system neuron is intact. Unlike your brain or your spinal cord, which is why if you have a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, that's a permanent loss of function, as opposed to maybe you cut yourself in your finger, it was deep, you got some stitches, felt weird for a couple of months, but then the sensation came back. When we look at the 3 different types of neurons overall, you're going to notice when we look at sensory, inter, and motor, something should be like, wait, deja vu a little bit. These mirror, the name of the neuron mirrors the function. So there are neurons who are specific for the sensory function, neurons who are specific for the integration function. They're the between the neurons, in other words, the between the sensation and the got to do something about it. So they are integrating, they're the between. And then there's the motor neurons. Those are the ones taking messages from your brain or from your spinal cord out to your muscles, for example, or could be like an adrenal gland or something. But a lot of times we're going to be talking about muscles. So this is always going up towards the brain, sensory neuron guys. These motor neurons are always going away from the brain, and the interneurons are always part of the brain or the spinal cord. You can see that their function is going to dictate what they look like, which makes sense because you guessed it, structure leads to function. But in terms of the type of neuron you will be expected to label, it will always be this motor neuron guy. Since our next unit is on muscles, we're going to connect, we talked about bones, we're going to now in this unit talk about sending messages, and then in our next unit we'll talk about how a muscle contracts so that we can put it all together. Your brain will send a message down a motor neuron, tell the muscle to contract, we'll learn how that happens, and that contraction will cause movement around a joint because the muscle is pulling on bones. So it is true that the sensory guy, if this is going to be specialized if it's hot, if it's cold, a pressure, these will be specialized to each of those different functions or senses. And then when we talk about your interneuron, there's all kinds of, this is where information comes in. You can see like your brain's got to integrate a lot of information, whereas guy coming out looks a little bit different. So, but we'll always look at this guy in terms of our labeling. So that's what we're going to do. Let's label that motor neuron. So these are the parts of a motor neuron or a neuron. And so we're going to start with where the information comes into this cell. And so dendrites, that's are all of these extensions out here. Dendra means little tree. Somebody thought these looked like branches, but all these little branches are little extensions of the cell body where information is going to be received. And so there can be another cell, for example, communicating to this cell, like sending information. There could be someone else sending information, someone sending information from over here. And so if this was you, for example, and you had to make a decision, in this case, am I going to send a message or not send a message? Am I going to fire or not fire? But you had to make some kind of decision. Buy something, don't buy something, as an analogy. You might have lots of friends sending you, giving you advice. And so you have to have lots of dendrites, because you're taking information from lots of different places. So information will always come into the dendrites. Your cell body is the main part of the cell. If we had to go back to generic cell, generic animal cell, then, that circular guy, and you're like, right now, you're like, I didn't know cells could look so funny. But this was like that main cell, that cell body. And it has a nucleus inside. It has all of its organelles. The DNA is in here. It makes proteins out here. It has its little Golgi, all that kind of fun stuff. That's the main, what you think of as just cell. But there's extensions that have jobs. So we have receiving coming out of the cell body. So give me the information. Your cell body will process that information. Okay, I'm going to get all that information and make a decision. And then it's going to start, am I going to fire and pass this message along, or am I not going to fire and pass this message along? We're going to decide, yes, fire, pass the message along. So that's this guy's job right here. So this axon extends out of the cell body, away from the cell body, and it's going to take a message down this way till it gets to the end of the cell. The end of the cell is then going to potentially like send a message to the next cell. So we have, here's us, like we're this one cell. Are we going to pass the message to the next cell? That's what our job is going to be. So there would be a muscle cell on the other side. So if we need to send a message to our muscle cell, we'll be getting information. The cell body will process it. Yes, we need to pass this message and cause our muscle cell to contract. So I'm going to send the message down the axon. And notice when the axon gets to the end, it can split so that it actually can send its message to more than one muscle cell. And so these are called axon terminals. So a terminal means end. So you are at the end of the axon. So where you split, you have all these axon terminals. And at the very, very tip of the axon terminal, you have what are called synaptic end bulbs. If you have taken psychology, you may have heard it called a terminal button, a synaptic button, a terminal bulb. Like there's obviously more than one term for this extension that you can't really see. Well, I'm going to blow up a picture here in a second. That's like a little, like, imagine a bulby end down here, like it comes in like a skinny neck and then bulges out. That's what we're going to have, is like a bulb at the very end here. And that's where there'll be some chemicals that are going to be our message that gets passed to the next cell. So let's look at a blow up of that. So you can see receiving dendrites, cell body, coming down the axon terminals, here's all of our split, and then see how there's this like bulb at the end. If I blow that bulb up, so you can see he's bigger here, inside are structures called a vesicle. A vesicle is just a plasma membrane bubble. That's really all it is a bunch of phospholipids in a little circle. So think of like a balloon, and inside there's going to be chemicals. Those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. They're going to transmit the message from one neuron to another neuron. So at the very end here, you can see here's chemicals stored in a vesicle. If a message comes down the axon, message, it will cause these vesicles to move and release these chemicals, these neurotransmitters, into this space so that the next cell in line gets that message. So you can see his message, causes the vesicle to move, spits chemical into the space that will then tell the next cell what it needs to say. So like I said before, you could see at your cell body, there's all these different dendrites. You could be receiving information from lots of places. If this is you, right, this little extension from a dendrite, you could have lots of friends telling you what you should do. Like, should I buy, should I buy this new phone? Like I just pick something out of my head, and you have to make a decision. Oh my God, it's so expensive. Like, do I really need all these features? My old phone's working fine. Like, I don't know. And you're going to have different friends with a different opinion. Yes, you have to have the newest, latest, and greatest phone. It's so amazing. The camera is so much better. And someone else will be like, your phone's fine. That's a ridiculous amount of money. I've heard this one, it's okay, it's great, but there's going to be a better one that's coming out in 6 months, so just wait it out. So you have people with opinions, right? And then you have to decide as the cell, do I buy or do I not buy that phone? The equivalent for this cell, for this neuron, is, do I fire and send this message down my axon, or do I not fire and send the message down the axon? Obviously, we're going to say fire, because otherwise we'd have nothing to talk about. And so the message gets to the end, and these little vesicles with neurotransmitter can pass that message to the next cell. I also think of this like if this was the office and they needed to send a message, they send those little blue slips like, you need to come and see me. And so the blue slip is the neurotransmitter, floating through school, and then it gets to the classroom, and then there's going to be a response. So a lot of axons, if you are talking especially about the peripheral nervous system, all the axons actually in the peripheral nervous system have another cell on the outside that creates a material called the myelin sheath as a whole. So you can see all this stuff wrapped around the axon down here. That's called the myelin sheath as a whole. So what is the myelin sheath made of? It's made up of proteins and lipids. Lipids are hydrophobic, so think of it as like an insulator. So it's like keeping stuff in. So its big job is to hold the message that's being passed, that action potential message that's being passed on the axon, keep it inside. So again, if I'm going back to my cord analogy, where you have like the plug for your vacuum cleaner or a lamp, for example, you have the rubber coating on the outside. and then there's wires on the inside. The rubber coating on the outside would be the myelin sheath. And so it keeps the charge inside the neuron cell itself. Because it keeps the charge inside, that makes the message pass much faster down the axon. So if, for example, you might have a neuron that starts at your let's say, like, let me think, like from your spinal cord, you have messages going down your spinal cord, but you have to like tell your quadricep muscle, or maybe even your toes. Let's make your toes because they're far away. So at the end, at the base of your vertebral column, you have nerves that come out, and then those nerves are going to carry neurons all the way down to your muscles in your toes. That's a long cell. That's a really long cell. And so you want that message to go fast. When your brain says, go big toe, go, like wiggle, it's not like you think, go big toe, and then it takes a whole bunch of time, and then you get to move your big toe. You say it, like as soon as you think it, you're able to do it, because you have to have that message pass very quickly. And so the myelin sheath allows for the message to stay inside the axon, and then it travels super fast. So if you are myelinated, that means you have a myelin sheath. If you are unmyelinated, there are some central nervous system neurons that do not have myelin because the axons are so short. In essence, it won't make it go any faster because the axon's so short. It doesn't need to be myelinated. So I have an analogy for that. It's like if I was racing like the Olympic gold, so let's just say anybody in the Olympics at all who was in track, if it was like me versus them, and someone said go, and like we had to go from my classroom like across into the office, like across the quad to the office, like they're going to totally win, like hands down. The only thing that's going to help me is if I have something that helps me go faster, like myelin, in this case, something with wheels and a motor. If we're talking about a very short distance, if I only had to go, like a foot, then there's a chance that when someone said go, like I'm not going to be that far behind the Olympic gold, anybody in the Olympics at all, because you're only going a foot. So very short neurons in your brain don't need to be myelinated, but all your peripheral nervous system neurons have to be myelinated because they have a long way to go from your hands up to your brain, from your brain down to your hands, from your brain down to your feet. That's a long way to go. When you look at what's making that myelin, there is a cell that wraps itself around the axon, and you can see that over here. This cell is like giving it a hug. He's a flat cell. He's giving it a hug, and he like wraps himself around, and he keeps making more protein and more lipids, more protein and more lipids, and he just keeps wrapping his little self around there and making all of these layers of protein and lipids, and that's the insulation. So that's like the rubber coating around the outside. Notice there are two different kinds of cells. One cell that makes myelin for the peripheral nervous system and one for the central nervous system. So oligodendrocytes make myelin in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells make myelin for the peripheral nervous system. How I remember who is who. So this is going to be one of those stupid little like memory things that have nothing to do with anything. But Schwann sounds like swan, the bird, the pretty bird. And swans as a bird, they're pretty. Pretty begins with P. So Schwanns are pretty. Pretty begins with P, so it's the peripheral nervous system. So that's how I remember, is that Schwanns are pretty. So I know Schwann isn't really a swan, but that's how I remember. Schwanns are pretty, and I do have a fear that someday I'll be like 95 years old with no memory, and all I will remember is things like that. Schwanns are pretty, and no one will know what I'm talking about. So looking here, we've got a cell wrapping around wrapping around this neuron axon, creating myelin. He's an oligodendrocyte. Is he a central nervous system neuron or a peripheral nervous system neuron? Schwanns are pretty, so therefore oligodendrocyte is the other guy. He's the central nervous system. And notice you do here just have an example of neurons right down here that are unmyelinated versus this guy up here is myelinated. Again, central nervous system. I'm sure you noticed that there's little spaces in between in these individual cells. Those exposed spaces of axon are called the nodes of Ranvier. It is one of I have like a top 10 list of favorite vocabulary words in biology, and nodes of Ranvier is totally on it because you have to say it like nodes of Ranvier. So in these nodes of Ranvier-Sanse, this is going to be really important in how the message is passed. So we'll come back to that in another set of notes. But he is very, very important, these little exposed parts. When labeling, be very careful. Notice myelin sheath is you're pointing to more than one of these guys, whereas a Schwann cell or an oligodendrocyte, but is only pointing to one. So if there's a line pointing to one of these guys, that's the cell that's creating, that myelin sheath. If I'm pointing to more than one, 2, 3, 4 sections of all of this stuff, that is how you're going to correctly label myelin. So at the end of the cell, we've passed it. We get the message all the way to the end. We know we're sending this chemical message across. Whenever you have that junction between one cell and a second cell, that's called a synapse. So in this case, we're going to be talking about chemical junctions, where we're going to have an electrical message become a chemical message, that neurotransmitter, and then it's going to start a new electrical message in our next cell. So we find these synapses between two neurons, for example, so one neuron passing to another neuron, for example, like in our brain. So you're going to have a presynaptic cell before the synapse, before the space, or the postsynaptic cell after the space. In our next unit, we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on a motor neuron sending a message from our brain to a particular muscle cell to cause contraction so that we get movement. You could have a synapse for the messages going up to your brain. So the sensory receptor that says cold, cold, cold is going to pass that message from the receptor cell to the sensory neuron that will take the message the rest of the way up to our brain for processing. And it is possible to have a neuron giving a message to a gland cell, such as an adrenal gland cell. So if something were to scare you and you had that, like your brain's like, we have to run, you're going to have a message coming down that neuron, giving an information to the gland cell, and dump adrenaline into your blood supply, and you'll be like, oh, I'm ready to run. Like you'd be like all alert. So when we look at what is the name of that space of the synapse is called the synaptic cleft. So cleft means space. So I don't know if you've ever seen like someone have a cleft chin, where their chin kind of like comes in, like indents in and then comes back out. Or we've talked about cleft palate in our skeletal system, where someone had that space because the maxilla bone didn't fuse correctly. So these chemical synapses, we're going to go presynaptic cell, will release, which is sending an electrical message, will release neurotransmitters, which is the chemical, that's this guy here, and create a brand new electrical message in our postsynaptic cell. All right, so we're not going electrical message and just passing that same message on. We're going to have middleman, that neurotransmitter, and it may seem inefficient to have middleman. Like, why can't we just pass this electrical message straight to that guy? That can happen in some parts of your body, and it does make things faster. But what you lose, because you don't have these chemicals in the middle, you're losing the control of do you really want this guy to fire or not, and how often. And so if this was an electrical message touching this cell, like they were completely touching and I just pass the electrical message, this guy doesn't have a choice. He would get the electrical message and have to fire. We will talk about how neurotransmitters will allow for fine-tuning, like how much do you fire, should you fire, so it's going to allow for more flexibility. So here's just another picture of what these vesicles really look like blown up big. We always just draw them as a line. They are a big pile of phospholipids with those chemicals on the inside. So you can see electrical message causing the vesicle to move, spilling neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, initiating a brand new electrical message on the other side. So that's this little red line is the electrical message, and you just get a brief little blip over here, and boom, new electrical message. So here's just some different pictures. You can see the end. This is the axon terminal. Here's the synaptic end bulb with all those different vesicles on the inside. You can't see in these vesicles, you can't see the neurotransmitter. You can just see them, they just show them as green, and the green neurotransmitter spilling across into the space. And here's your postsynaptic cell. So you got your synaptic cleft in the middle, postsynaptic cell down here. Here you take your presynaptic cell and your postsynaptic cell, and they just blew up the synapse here so you could see one synaptic end bulb and the dendrites on the postsynaptic cell. You could also have your sensory receptors. So this is like messages going to a muscle, for example, or from one brain cell to another brain cell. But here, if you need to send a message up to your brain, you just have the sensory receptor cell. So maybe you're tasting something, and then he's like, ooh, we've got our signal, we're tasting something, and he's going to send a message to the postsynaptic cell, which is this yellow guy right here. So they don't have it blown up so that to see the neurotransmitter, but he would be right in there. One thing to note before we move to the next slide is you can see lots of mitochondria. Lots of mitochondria. Mitochondria, what is it making? Energy, right? Powerhouse of the cell. It's taking glucose or food and converting it into usable energy. So this is a very active process. It's going to need lots of energy, which is why thinking requires, like you're doing all this thinking down here, brain cell to brain cell, that burns calories. Muscles being moved, they're going to burn a lot of calories because it takes a lot of energy to cause this process to happen. So when we talk about these neurotransmitters, like what are they saying? So they're passing a message. Like, what is that message? Some of those messages are going to be what are considered excitatory, like you should fire, to the next cell. If it's another neuron, like you should fire. Or if it's a muscle cell, you should contract. Some messages actually say don't fire. So it's an inhibitory message, like I don't want you to fire. And it seems weird that you would send like an inhibitory message. But if every neuron in your body was firing and sending excitatory messages, like you'd be twitching all over the place. Sometimes you actually say don't fire because you're not supposed to be doing anything right now. So they've identified lots of different kinds of neurotransmitters. We are not going to go into every single one of these. We're going to kind of group them as kind of an overall and call it done. So just so you can see over here, if this is the postsynaptic cell membrane, so let me go back to a picture. So here you are down here, and you're like in this membrane right here. If we were to blow this up big, where green circle is coming in to this membrane on the second cell. So this is the membrane of that second cell. You can see there's a protein embedded in it. If that neurotransmitter is excitatory, when he binds to it, he's going to cause a shape change, and he's going to open, and look, positive messages coming in. You should fire. You should really fire. An example of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, we're going to have our protein here. He's a different protein embedded in that postsynaptic membrane. Neurotransmitter binds. In this case, it caused a shape change, but look, there's a negative message coming in. Don't fire. Don't fire. And so that will be important tomorrow. We'll or in our next lecture when we kind of tie this together. So these are the neurotransmitters we're going to focus on. These are like the ones that are commonly talked about. Our next unit is going to focus on acetylcholine like crazy. Nobody wants to ever spell acetylcholine, so this is the abbreviation. Everybody uses the abbreviation. As long as you have capital A, capital C, lowercase h, you're good to go. He's an excitatory neurotransmitter from a motor neuron telling your muscle cell it's time to contract. We need you to contract. We have some movement to do. So this is going to be found at what's called a neuromuscular junction. So from a neuron to a muscle cell. So it's that synapse. So he's one we're going to focus a lot on. Other neurotransmitters, I'm going to group epinephrine and norepinephrine together. The common name for epinephrine is adrenaline. And so keep in mind, there's a difference between epinephrine as a neurotransmitter or epinephrine as a hormone. Epinephrine as a neurotransmitter going from one cell to another cell, like in your brain, is going to help you focus, right? It's going to help you in your thinking processes. It's going to help you pay attention to things. However, when we do talk fight or flight response later, like how you have that, like if you almost fall asleep at the wheel, or maybe a car like almost hits you, and you're like, and you have that moment, you're like, and you feel super alert. That is acting as a hormone. So same chemical, but in a different place in your brain, helping you focus. In your blood supply as a hormone, causing the fight or flight response. So just keep in mind, he's got the same guy, just doing different jobs in a different place. Dopamine and serotonin, I'm going to group together, even though they are distinctly different neurotransmitters and act in different ways on your brain, but I'm going to group them because as a whole, these guys have an effect on how you feel. So they will help. They do have a role in helping you learn, helping you pay attention. But a lot of the times we do hear about them associated with your mood. So dopamine by itself is part of the pleasure center part of your brain, for example. So whenever if you've ever had your favorite food, like let's say you love chocolate, just to pick something, and you put chocolate on your tongue and you just have that like gleeful, like, oh my God, 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 I love, this is amazing. Or you take that first bite of pie or cake or something, you're just like, oh, and you get that rush of just yummy happiness. That's all dopamine. Dopamine flooding and hitting the pleasure center part of your brain, and you're like, yes. And so that way, that's why you keep eating. So you're like going back for the second bite, third bite. The 10th or 20th bite, like they're not the same as the first bite. The first bite is always the best because of that dopamine rush hitting the pleasure center part of your brain. But all of these together are affecting lots of different areas about how we just feel overall. There are other drugs that can bind, or they're similar enough in shape that can bind to some of those receptors that then lead to some of the side effects of those drugs. So you're talking about like LSD causing hallucinations and things like that. So that's, like, what am I seeing? Am I being able to pay attention? Like, so these kinds of things will affect those receptors because they have the same shape. Endorphins, we love endorphins. These guys, notice they decrease the perception of pain. So they're an inhibitory guy. So you are like running for a long period of time. And at first, maybe you start running and you're like, oh my God, this is so hard. This is horrible. But then like you kind of push through that. And every once in a while you push through that and you just like get into a groove. And you're like, I feel like amazing. I'm like an Olympian runner myself. And you're like singing in your head, dun, 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 like you're like, I'm amazing. Your endorphins have been released into your brain, and all those pain messages going in your brain, they're being dampened. So you feel great. We love endorphins. For women who are like, go natural childbirth, they're counting on endorphins to like help them through that. Notice we've got mimics similar in shape to endorphins, but they do a ridiculous job binding to those same receptors. So like if someone's in extreme pain, they will give them morphine, for example, very addictive. But if you're kind of like at the end of your life fighting that kind of pain, it doesn't matter if it's addictive. Heroin, obviously extremely addictive, and this is where it gets people into trouble. Super addictive, decreasing all sensations of pain, and so that's obviously causing problems. Histamine, you may have heard of like antihistamine, but histamine is coming from a very specific part of your brain, and it's keeping you alert. So which is why if you've ever taken an antihistamine, like Benadryl, for example, and it makes you like pass right out, because it is counteracting the effect of this histamine in your brain. And so we love the histamine going in our brain. This is a second type. So we spent all this time talking about neurons. Neural glial cells, or glial cells for short, are that second type of nervous system cell. And notice there's a ton more of them than neurons. Their job is not to send a message. However, they provide structure, they protect, they insulate. They're helpers. They're neuron helpers. Like, keep that in mind. If you just like, okay, I'm a neuron helper, your support team. So think about like principal of a school. They're in charge. Can they do this? Can they run a school by themselves? No, there's tons of support teams. There's all those people in the office, all our maintenance people, our custodial crew, the teachers, like all these people helping run a school. So neuron may be message sender, but you can't do anything without your big giant support team. So that's the glial cells. Some of the neural glial cells, they can divide. I'm not going to ask you this part down here. This is more of an FYI. So I want you to know a few examples, 3 examples of neuroglial cells, and 2 of them we've already talked about. So Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes are glial cells support team. Remember, their job is supporting the neuron, wrapping themselves around the axon in order to make the message go faster. So remember, Schwanns are pretty, oligodendrocytes are the other guy. The third kind of glial cell is called an astrocyte. Astro as a root means star. So it's a star cell. In other words, someone thought it looked kind of like a star. And its big job is blood-brain barrier. So your blood-brain barrier is literally like, I'm the bouncer guy who's going to stay here and like decide whether you get into the neuron in your brain. And so we've got stuff, running through your blood. Does it have access to the neurons of your brain? It's got to go through the astrocyte first. It's got to go through the blood-brain barrier. So its job is to keep harmful things out, to keep a more stable environment for your brain, because your brain is so important. Is the blood-brain barrier perfect? Does it keep all harmful things out? No, it does not keep all harmful things out. We know alcohol can get in, for example, certain drugs can get in, but so blood-brain barrier is not perfect, but it does keep lots of harmful things out. The reason I bring the blood-brain barrier up is if you are doing research on a drug, for example, and you're trying to target neurons in the brain, you have to take into consideration, can your drug get past the blood-brain barrier? If it can't, it doesn't matter how amazing it is, it's not going to treat any diseases, like you can talk about Parkinson's disease, or you're talking about, you're looking at dementia, for example, or Alzheimer's. Like, what do we need to do in the brain? You've got to take the blood-brain barrier into account. One little side note about the blood-brain barrier is that medicines like Benadryl, we know, can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause an interruption of histamine, and so therefore you get sleepy and pass out if you take Benadryl as an antihistamine. Knowing that, what researchers did is they're like, how can we need people to be able to take antihistamines because people have allergies. So what can we do? Can we design an antihistamine that works against the histamines that are in your other locations, like in your eyes, your throat, your skin, so within your blood supply, that is not going to target, not be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So in other words, it will work everywhere else in your body, but not your brain, because you don't have allergies in your brain, but you are using histamine in your brain to stay alert. The histamine being released by other cells in your body is part of your is part of an immune response. It's a part of an allergic response. We'll talk about later. It is needed, but sometimes it's overactive and misdirected. And so when you release histamine from certain cells in your tissues, like in your throat or on your skin, that's when you get that, the allergy symptoms. So you want antihistamine to work everywhere but your brain. So what they did is they designed medicines that are an antihistamine, so works everywhere else, but can't cross the blood-brain barrier. And that's where we have Allegra, and you have Zyrtec, all of those guys, Claritin, they are like a second generation antihistamine specifically designed so that they can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Woohoo! So now you can take your antihistamine and not pass out. Good times. So here you can just see you've got your blood vessel. You want to make sure, in this case, what things can cross. You want good stuff to cross, not bad stuff. So these new Allegras and whatnot can't cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're stuck. They're stuck here, so they work everywhere else in the body, but they don't make you sleepy. All right. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out. Have a good day.